So firstly, I wanted just to say a very warm welcome to everyone. This is the very first event of our first series of the new research group. While thinking about how we could best start things off, that the idea of keywords came up as what seemed like an excellent way of starting things off for the group. And I think a talk about equality, which is what we're going to have today, a discussion about equality, seems an excellent way to start off the series. The idea of keywords and drawing on Raymond Williams' original concept, or at least using that as a starting point, seemed like an excellent topic for this series, not only because it brings together issues of language, culture, literature, and politics, because I think we're also currently living through a period where debates and often sort of all-out fights about certain terms, what they represent, how they should be defined, is absolutely central to the way that the public conversation takes place. So Williams defined keywords as ones where the problems of their meanings seem inextricably bound up with the problems they're being used to discuss. And I think in the age of Twitter, the way that arguments about words act as arguments about values is sort of a very salient part of, as I say, of the public conversation. And so with that being the general aim of the series, we're delighted to be joined to this first event by Teresa Bejan, who's Professor of Political Theory at Oxford. And as I say, she's going to be talking today about her work on the concept of equality. Teresa's work is on what might, I guess, in modern terminology, be described as issues that relate to social justice, although, of course, that's a term which itself is very loaded. And she takes a historical perspective on what foundational concepts, as well as the words used to refer to them. Her first book was on the concept of civility, mere civility, disagreement, and the limits of tolerance. And that's another fascinating concept, which in certain contexts, due to its recent history of use, is seen as problematic often, and is often debated within the context of this notion of us living through a sort of crisis of civility. And her current work is what she's going to talk about today, which is going to be this notion of equality and how this has been understood at various junctures in history. So I'll pass over to Teresa and look forward to having a discussion with everyone afterwards.
Well, thank you, Philip, and also thanks to Sally and to Dan and to all of you for coming. It's really an honor to be here. And I was saying before, I'm really excited as a political theorist and historian of political thought to be able to think aloud and get feedback from audiences in language and literature and other areas that I don't normally get the benefit of hearing from. So thanks for that. So yeah, as Philip mentioned, my brief today is to talk to you about equality, both about the word itself and about the many different ideas that we attach to it. And I'm currently writing a book that's focused on one idea in particular. That's the idea sometimes described as human equality, or what political theorists and philosophers like me tend to describe as basic equality. Simply the idea that human beings as such are in some sense equal, and that this should have in turn important consequences, and indeed egalitarian consequences, for their social, political, and perhaps even economic arrangements. And as Philip alluded to, what I'm doing is both in the domain of history of concepts, but it's also in the domain of the history of words, and that I'm interested in a particular word, equality, as attached to a particular idea, that is, of this kind of equality of human beings as such. This is an important idea historically. The Oxford legal and political philosopher Ronald Dworkin would like to say that equality was basic equality was the defining commitment of modernity. We could distinguish between a modern era where people are basically committed to the idea that human beings are equal, and a pre-modern era when they were not. And it's this sense of equality as pertaining to human beings as being as a kind of normative ideal that was included by Raymond Williams in Key Words in 1976. And so I had a really good time going back to that text in preparing for this talk. So according to Williams, what had been primarily mathematical or social senses of equality in kind of ancient and pre-modern eras gave way to what he describes as a more general and normative condition in the 16th and 17th centuries. So Williams' chosen example in his entry comes from Book 12 of Paradise Lost, in which the Archangel Michael describes to Adam the condition of mankind after the flood as that of, quote, fair equality, fraternal state. And Williams here points, and I fear this is mistakenly, to the so-called levelers of the English Civil War as an early example of a group putting this normative condition in the service of a kind of economic program of economic leveling. But in any case, Williams suggests that equality as a kind of normative principle fades after the 17th century until its resurgence in the late 18th century in association with the American and French revolutions. And their associated legal and political demands. And Williams rightly notes that the term egalitarian is an invention of the 18th century and indeed of the 19th century, and indeed the late 19th century, and it's used to characterize the project of the French Revolution and gets adopted into English from there. So Williams's entry about equality makes a number of important points that I just want to highlight. So the first is that Williams acknowledges the significance of the continuing priority of equality as a mathematical concept in English, as well as a political and moral one. And indeed, he notes that the mathematical sense of equality can lead to problems when we invoke equality as a political or especially a social concept. Secondly, Williams notes that the English word equality is a borrowing from French, and of course, before that from Latin, and it has roots in the Latin term equus, meaning level, even, or just, right? So sort of three associated ideas, and all of them are important. Now, something Williams doesn't mention here, but I think that is worth noting, is that the Latin equus in these three senses corresponds directly with the Greek term isos, which also means level or even, and indeed, as Aristotle reminds us, can also mean just. But why? Right? Why are these three senses of to ison associated? Well, the association with justice derives from an ancient technology, namely the balance beam scale, which was the central invention that lived at the heart of the Greek marketplace or agora. And there, in the agora, with the help of the scale, goods or specie could be measured against the standard weights issued by the polis. And this enabled precision then in measurement when establishing equality of value for the purpose of a just exchange, right? So if we want to think about why equality carries these senses, well, it derives from a particular concrete material reality, that is sort of the practice of weighing and looking to when the two sides of the scale are equal or even. Now, Williams doesn't mention this, it's a short entry, but it's important, I think, and it helps explain particularly why using the term equality, even today, places us simultaneously in the realms of precision, of quantitative measurement, and also that of a kind of less precise area of comparison between incommensurables or non-commensurables. And that is a kind of domain of justice and a search for equivalence. And, this is a pretty thorny problem that gets worked out in all sorts of different ways, one of which is coinage. And that's something I'm really interested in, how the inventage of coinage allows for a kind of precise and authoritatively countable measure of value. But in any case, this history explains why normatively the Greek noun isoteta and the Latin aequalitas were associated not only with justice, but perhaps even more importantly with another normative ideal, which is the ideal of balance. And there we can see ancient associations going beyond mathematics and economics to cosmology and really crucially to medicine. So the idea that aequalitas expresses an ideal of balance or harmony, and that characterizes a healthy body. Now, of course, there's some complications here, complications that are, I think, implicit in Williams's account, but sort of bear being made explicit. One is that, English borrows a lot of words from French and from Latin, but it also borrows words from German. And the term in German here, though, is not equality at all. It's Gleichheit. So that comes from the German word gleich, which is cognate with the English alike. And I think the fact that we have so often in English many terms for similar ideas just reminds us of the wide landscape of terms that can and have been associated with ideas of equality in English, not only likeness, but identity, sameness, and similarity. and also more obscure ones. So Williams highlights the historical salience of fraternity, but I would argue that other concepts are actually more important. So concepts of indifference, commonality, parity, which is something I've written quite a bit about, as well as balance. Indifference, though, let's talk a bit about indifference. So I think it's worth highlighting because it draws our attention to some of the distinctiveness, again, of equality talk in English. So again, to return to German. In German, there's also a word, egal, sort of equal, but it's used precisely to express indifference. So the phrase es ist mir egal means, it's indifferent to me. It's like the French ça m'est égal. I don't care. It's a matter of indifference. In English, we wouldn't say that, though. We would say, it's all the same to me. We would not say, I submit, it's all equal to me. Although we would say maybe all being equal. But what's interesting there is that the expression all being equal is a translation of a Latin principle, ceteris paribus. So there's parity again, you see. So it's actually, maybe it's a little bit complicated, these issues of translation. And especially the idea that there's not simply one kind of Latin word, principle, or concept, but this other one of parity, which is historically significant. In English, we use equal colloquially, I think, not to mean indifferent, but in a more positive way. So we'll use expressions like I am or I am not equal to this task. She is without equal. She is not my equal, or I am not her equal. That is, we use equal in English as a synonym for peer, suggesting a high or elevated, a dignified status. I think this is the sense of basic equality described by Jeremy Waldron as a principle, not that human beings as such are equal, but that human beings as such are one another's equals. And he links this to ideas of human dignity. This is also incidentally a borrowing from French, derived from Latin. The word peer, is a borrowing from French, the Latin coming from the Latin par or pares. And in Latin, in sort of classical and post-classical Latin, there's a contrast between paritas on the one hand and equalitas on the other. So the former connoting a sense of shared rank, especially social rank, on the basis of value, worth, or weight, and the other being premised on shared measure, quantitative measure. My favorite classic example of the contrast comes from Cicero's De Senectute, of old age, in which one speaker distinguishes between those who are equal with respect to age and those who are peers with respect to status or virtue. So in English, it seems to me that equality talk, if you will, is distinctly elevated in a few different ways. Firstly, it's Latinate and thus seems or sounds learned, as opposed to the Old English or German alike. Secondly, it has strong mathematical connotations that suggest precision, truth, and even a kind of transcendence. We definitely see that in modern philosophical discussions of basic equality, which is often described as axiomatic. Or consider the preamble to the American Declaration of Independence in 1776, which notoriously described the fact that all men were created equal as a, quote, self-evident, unquote, truth. To speak of equality, then, is to place oneself, or at least attempt to place oneself, firmly in the realm of irresistible logic. It's a way of ending an argument, really, rather than opening it up. Thirdly, and this is something I've argued in a recent article, the language of parity, I think, has fallen out of modern English in interesting ways, which has led the term equality to sort of do double duty, to describe peers as well as things that are merely equal. And the reasons for this, I think, are complex and contingent and has to do with the specificity of the class of English peers under the common law and debates about Magna Carta. I can go into those in the Q&A if you'd like. But in any case, if we look actually at the history of the term, things are a bit more complex than just a kind of self-evident moral truth about our relative status. So to go back to Williams's book for a moment, what strikes me most now, looking at it, and after working on equality for a couple of years, is the relative brevity of Williams's treatment. The entry on equality is simply dwarfed by others, for instance, those on class or culture. By contrast, if we go to the Geschichtliche Grundbegriffe, as I'm sure you all do very often, edited by Reinhard Koselleck and others, the article on Gleichheit spans almost 50 pages, but even that is relatively short compared to other entries in the GG. And I think we find a similar or surprising lack of detailed attention to the history and meaning of equality in the scholarly realms I'm most familiar with too, that is of political thought and intellectual history. There is as yet no equality before egalitarianism to match Quentin Skinner's seminal Liberty Before Liberalism, although I'm conscious you're going to be hearing from Quentin at the end of this series, so I should mind what I say. And of course, not under that name, I have a secure enough sense of my place and am sufficiently humble that I'm not entitling the book I'm working on Equality Before Egalitarianism. But it is partly what I'm trying to do in this book, is to sort of speak to that gap, fill that gap. But just for the purposes of concluding this talk, I would just note that I suspect that sort of the lack of scholarly and critical attention to the history of equality has to do with the prevalence of a just so story that we tell about how the modern commitment to basic equality came about. It's the story, I think, that roughly we find in Williams's entry, that the equality of human beings was discovered or invented in the 17th century, the key agents here being mid-century radicals, or what the Marxist historian Christopher Hill likes to call it the lunatic fringe of the English Revolution, groups like the Levelers, the Diggers, the Ranters, the early Quakers. And other scholars will now complicate that story. They'll say, well, look, this early modern discovery was actually a rediscovery. The crucial idea of human equality was an invention of the Stoics or the Christians or the Hebrew Bible. Or more recently, Seep Sturman in his book, The Invention of Humanity, has tried to present a less culturally chauvinistic account, saying that the idea of common humanity or human equality was an achievement is a global achievement across different societies in the axial age. But wherever the story starts, the trajectory of normative and narrative necessity is the same. Although early egalitarians will always generally lose the battle in their own day, they will win the war. Once the idea that human beings are equal is in place, political thinking can then become a fundamentally progressive project of putting the theoretical commitment of human equality into practice, first legally, then politically, then socially, and then economically. And that this is a program in which we are still engaged, I think. So we really, as scholars, see a kind of continuity between the place of equality in political life and argument with the subjects of our studies. And although, there are conflicts about the precise domains in which equality is most important, whether we should prioritize equality of outcome or equality of opportunity, nevertheless, the progressive story can then be shared between different sides, both sides of a political argument. Now, this kind of Whig story, if you will, about the rise and progress of equality has just recently been rather devastatingly dismantled by Anne Phillips in her most recent book called Unconditional Equals, and which I heartily recommend to you. But just for my own part, I'll just make a few observations in closing. So firstly, this just so story about equality repeated by Williams and others is just historically inaccurate. So if we think about the when of equality, so when do ideas that human beings are equal really come into play and become important? It turns out that the idea is really an ancient one. For example, the first century jurist Sabinus noted that omnes homines aequales sunt, that is, all humans are equal. And of course, here he meant with respect to natural law. And in expressing that idea, Sabinus was expressing what was and would continue to be a kind of legal and later a kind of religious commonplace for over a millennium, one seen, crucially, as entirely consistent with hierarchy of many different kinds, in many more and less complicated forms. So one assumption I think we need to jettison, and what I'm hoping to kind of put to bed in my work in studying equality, is a very modern assumption that equality and hierarchy are somehow antonyms, or that equality means that we must call all hierarchies into question. I think that's a modernist, modernizing assumption that's not borne out at all by how historical figures are using the word. So let's return to the example of Milton in Paradise Lost. In describing the fraternal state of fair equality, the Archangel Michael specifies that it's a state characterized by paternal rule. And implicitly, women are still under the rule of their fathers, husbands, and brothers. Now, the fashionable thing to do in pointing out that fraternity and associated concepts sort of exclude women would be to say, Milton is inconsistent, or to condemn him for having a blind spot, or say that he's a, sexist. Of course he was. But my point isn't sort of to condemn or rehabilitate Milton. It's rather to suggest that we really need to take his position seriously as a coherent one. Equality as a normative condition simply does not mean, for Milton, what modern egalitarians like Williams think it means. So let's take another example, one I'm working on at the moment. So it's from one of Christopher Hill's chosen exemplars in his book, The World Turned Upside Down. It's that of the ranter, the so-called ranter George Foster. So Foster is one of these many self-styled prophets who's running around London in the 1650s and who publishes 2 collections of his visions in 1650. In one, he reports seeing a man upon a white horse carrying a sword and, quote, cutting down all men and women that he met with that were higher than the middle sort, and raising up those that were lower, making them all equal, and crying out, equality, equality, I have now made men all alike, unquote. So for Hill and others, Foster is a prime example of the kind of proto-communistic true levelers of the period, who turned the idea that men and women were equal into a demand for economic leveling and the abolition of private property. But Foster's visions, and I would say too the visions of Jared Winstanley, sort of the leader of the Diggers, saw this post-leveling estate of fair equality as once again compatible with hierarchy and new hierarchies, in which, specifically for Foster, the proud and great would be pressed into bondage, admittedly happy bondage, and subjected to Foster's regenerate Christian brothers and sisters who would embrace the indwelling God or the indwelling Christ in them. Let's just say that this would be a class of people secure in their own sense of superiority. Again, it's not a blind spot. It's not an embarrassment. Rather, I think it's a fascinating and forgotten vision of equality before egalitarianism worth recovering, one obsessed with the Procrustean aspects of equality as a means of cutting the great ones down to size. And for Foster, he's clearly got the regicide on his mind. Charles I had been beheaded the year before. A lot of his visions in 1650 involve beheading. Of course, I'm a historian, but I'm not an antiquarian. So I would also say that these historical visions are important because they can help us understand the ways in which equality talk, if you will, today, also so often can or does go in unexpected directions, or indeed maybe goes wrong. And I think understanding this is all the more important given an important trend that we're seeing now on the progressive left, especially, which is a turn against equality, against the concept of equality. I shan't go into it in detail, but just notice the turn to equity talk in the realm of diversity and inclusion. Notice, too, the striking absence of equality talk in movements like Black Lives Matter or Me Too. The idea that equality as a principle is sort of hostile to difference, and therefore we should reject it and embrace principles like equity. What is gained and what is lost when we give up on equality, on the word as well as on the idea to which it has been attached? Well, of course, that's an open question. I'm not going to answer it because I've gone on too long already, but I look forward to hearing your questions and your thoughts. Thank you.